Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Sabiha Rahman.
And I'm Walter Ruby.
I am an American Muslim.
I'm an American Jew.
And we refuse to be enemies.
We certainly do. Sabiha, here we are, December 9th, and a month ago, we elected a new president named Donald J. Trump, who's going to be setting the agenda in America for at least the next 4 years. This is a very tough reality that we have to grapple with, and there is plenty of reason for apprehension. For example, what will be the impact on minority faith communities, Muslims and Jews in particular, and on our relationship?
You know, Walter, we have already gone through a rough patch in our Muslim-Jewish relationship building. The last 14 months have been devastating. It's heartbreaking to see the sufferings of the Palestinians in Gaza, 44,000 dead, hundreds and thousands injured and maimed, millions made homeless over and over again, and the pain of the families of hostages. It has consumed me.
And indeed, it's consumed me also, Sabiha, and so many other American Muslims and Jews. The death, destruction, anguish, and despair among both Palestinians and Israelis has overwhelmed us all. Nevertheless, we here live together here in the United States, not in the Middle East, and it is imperative for us to come together in America for the sake of American Muslims and Jews alike. For we are also under threat from authoritarian, even fascist currents swirling around us, though it must be said, those threats are not as immediate or dire as those that say the people of Gaza are presently enduring.
Agreed.
So let's today start with what the second Trump term may mean for Muslims and Jews in America. How does his elevation to the top change the equation? So let's first of all talk about Israel-Palestine. There seems a great likelihood that we're going to see a more hardline, pro-Israel, I would even say pro-right-wing Israeli factions that are now unfortunately in control of the Israeli government. We see that more likely to happen under the new Trump administration than would have been the case with say, Kamala Harris. We already see that Trump has appointed several pro-Israel zealots in key positions. One is Mike Huckabee, will be the new ambassador to Israel, a very strong evangelical who doesn't see an issue at all with Israeli settlements all over the West Bank. A negotiator, Steve Witkoff, also very hard line. Representative Elise Stefanik will be at the UN, and others like the former ambassador for the first Trump term, David Friedman, will be obviously somebody important, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who I should note last fall referred to Gaza as containing potentially, quote, valuable waterfront property, also very likely to be influential. So all of this could, this support for the hardline Israeli government could exacerbate the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and also in the West Bank, where it's at least conceivable that the US might now support Israeli annexation of most of the territory. Obviously, this has the potential to impact our relationships here at home, and certainly it gives the right wing in America opportunities to exploit and further fracture our communities.
You know, Walter, you and I have maintained all along that Muslims and Jews must remember that while most of us care deeply about Israel and Palestine, respectively, we live side by side in America, and we cannot afford to bring the conflict here at home. We need to disagree. We need to agree to disagree respectfully on Gaza, Israel, and set aside demands that the other must echo our positions as a condition to working together on causes here at home that are important to us. So let's prioritize rebuilding our alliance so that we may defend democracy, pluralism, and the rule of law here in the United States. And I would add that most notably, this should not and will not prevent us from continuing to work on relieving the suffering of the Palestinians and the families of the hostages. They go hand in hand.
I agree. And I think what we really need to do, our two communities, is to cut each other some slack on some of the contentious issues that divide us on Israel and Gaza, so that we're better able to work at home and also to work together even in supporting peace efforts over there. Examples of the kind of thing that these destructive cul-de-sacs that we've allowed ourselves to get into, which we should cut each other some slack on, including demands from the Jewish community that American Muslims denounce and Hamas for October 7th, for what happened on October 7th, or Muslims insisting that Jews should acknowledge that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. So to let go of that, which kind of pushes us into our respective tribal corners, is very hard to do. But do we really have a choice? And we should remember that we did manage to work before and build ties of communication and cooperation that came to fruition in the first Trump term. So again, Jews and Muslims built relationships over close to 2 decades, which are very vital, which still exist, and we need to now go back to that, to working together here at home while agreeing to disagree on Israel-Palestine. So we have to come together and work together for causes that directly impact our security and well-being in America, and not let the Middle East conflict get in the way.
Then, Walter, the second issue that we are going to face is the threat of white nationalism. And that can potentially lead to a surge in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. There can be curtailment of our civil rights and a threat to the safety of individuals and property and houses of worship. I worry about that.
Yeah, I think one place that we need to start, and we should stand together right now, is in opposition to Trump's announced plans to round up and detain millions of undocumented people before expelling them from the country. We as a country must find a humane solution for the immigration issue. Looking at our own traditions, let's not forget the timeless injunction in both our faiths to welcome the stranger. And let's not forget that millions of American Jews and Muslims came here to this country to escape life-threatening violence and oppression, and may need to do so again. Look, the prospect, the vision of America holding millions of defenseless people in camps behind barbed wire and breaking up families in the process evokes for many of us images of the Holocaust, no matter what the difference is between what happened then and what we're talking about now. It's still, that's what we're looking at. And this is a moral outrage that Americans of all faiths and all communities must oppose, with the clergy in the lead. So let Muslims and Jews play our own role in taking this important moral stand.
Absolutely.
Thanks. So then we go to another one, the threat to the separation of church and state. Right. And what we see, and we see this as a great threat to our two communities. So what we see just in recent weeks, that Republican state governments, Republican-led state governments are aggressively pushing conservative Christian principles into the public schools. So, for example, Oklahoma has announced the creation of an Office of Religious Freedom and Patriotism, and has called for public school students, to pray for President-elect Trump. While in Texas, the state education board has rolled out a new, what they call voluntary elementary school curriculum that is filled with Bible stories. Louisiana, for its part, has mandated the posting of the 10 Commandments in every schoolroom in the state, though that law is still presently being challenged in court as a fundamental violation of church and state.
And Walter, one early example of this trend was the Supreme Court's 2022 decision overturning Roe v. Wade. And that was based on conservative Christian principles. That ruling violates the rights recognized in our two faiths. We believe that a woman has the right to determine during the early months of pregnancy whether to carry her pregnancy to term. I have other concerns about the curtailment of religious freedom. Will freedom to worship be impacted? For example, will the call to prayer, the adhan from the mosques, be disallowed? Will prayer spaces in workplaces become an issue? Then there is the observance of religious holidays. Will the workplace environment continue to support that? Will the display of religious garb like the hijab or the yarmulke become a source of physical safety? I recall that in the aftermath of 9/11, Muslim charities were delegitimized. I wouldn't want to see that happening again. Will we see a resurgence of the anti-Sharia law, or perhaps another Muslim travel ban?
So in general, we must speak out against efforts to erode the separation of church and state in ways that empower ascendant Christian nationalism at the expense of the rights of minority faiths like our own. Clearly, the effort now coming from the new Trump administration will be to force evangelical Christianity into the public schools and ultimately destroy public schools altogether. After all, Project 2025 has called explicitly for the closing of the Department of Education. And let's not forget the wave of book bannings that have taken place in school districts across Florida and other states, focusing on many books, and many of them by distinguished authors, dealing with issues of sexuality, race, and religion. Let's remember that in a explicitly Christianized America, without the openness and pluralism that has allowed our two communities to flourish over decades, non-Christians will be at best second-class citizens. Now, Jews might have protective minority status, given the kind of friendship, as it were, that evangelicals say they feel for the Jewish community. So we might be given protected minority status, but as long as we keep quiet and accept the principle of Christian supremacy and don't speak out against Trump administration degrees for example, ruling out a long-needed reckoning with slavery and institutional racism in American history, the rolling back of women's rights and gay rights, and limiting freedom of speech. But it could even be worse for Muslims, because Islam is seen as demonic by many evangelical Christians who will likely be in very high positions. For example, it's jarring to consider that the Secretary of Defense nominee, Pete Hegseth, has a tattoo of a Crusader knight on his chest, apparently, and other such tattoos on his arms. Let's not forget that the Crusaders that he sees as his role models apparently massacred Jews and Muslims alike when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem in 1099 AD. And Hegseth was recently reported in the New Yorker to have been at one point out with a bunch of people drunkenly chanting "Kill all Muslims." So all of that. And then going even deeper and more fundamentally, let's not forget that the Trump movement has been replete with ideologues, Tucker Carlson and many others, avowing the great replacement theory, which contends that Democrats want to replace white Americans with brown and black people from so-called shithole countries, to use Trump's term. Such thinking and action could lead to increased violence against minorities, very much including Jews and Muslims, especially given the heavily armed state of this country. let's not forget for a moment that the white nationalist perpetrator of the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh, when he stormed into that synagogue and murdered 11 Jews at prayer, he blamed Jews for trying to destroy America by bringing in Black and brown people. And he's an extreme case, but he's not the only one. The MAGA movement and many of Trump's acolytes have given voice to anti-Semitic attacks on the likes of George Soros for supposedly propounding internationalism and cosmopolitanism to the detriment of American patriotism and America first. And that's a slogan, of course, that was first used by the Charles Lindbergh-led movement back in the late 30s and 40s of the last century, which argued that America should not go to war to stop the march of Nazism and Adolf Hitler across Europe, but instead we should just concentrate on our own continent. And we see, I think, echoes of that now. Let's, abandon Ukraine. It's more important what happens on the, U.S. southern border than what happens on some border in the other hemisphere. And so finally, to continue, we then come to the question of the curtailment of free speech. So just yesterday, Sabia, I can't say I was shocked, but it was still chilling to see an interview that Trump did with NBC News with Meet the Press, where he said that members of the January 6th Select Committee, like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Bernie Thompson, Adam Schiff, and Jamie Raskin, and others, should be in jail. Although he said, well, he wouldn't do it. That's up to his Attorney General designate Pam Bondi or FBI Director designate Kash Patel. They'll be the ones to make those decisions. And some Republicans said, well, you see, he really doesn't really want to do it. But does anybody seriously believe that these two fanatically loyal designates who were chosen for that very reason, the complete loyalty to Trump, not to the Constitution, not to the, Department of Justice, do we believe for a second that they would not carry out Trump's stated desires to have his opponents jailed? In fact, a week ago, Patel sent a letter to Olivia Troy, who quit the Trump administration over the attempt to overthrow the government on January 6, 2001. So he's now threatening to sue her for libel. Patel has a long enemies list, which he wrote about in a book he did, which includes Troy and other investigators of Trump's abuses, like Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, and again, Senator-elect Adam Schiff. Trump has explicitly threatened as he did yesterday, threatened Liz Cheney with jail. And he said that at various times he's also threatened Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and others with imprisonment. And he's even called for the execution of General Mark Milley, the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for treason. So again, the fact that he would appoint people like Bondi and Patel to the two most important law enforcement positions makes clear that he plans to prosecute enemies whose only discernible sin was to oppose him politically. And he's showing that he is deadly serious about gaining retribution against his perceived enemies. This is a grave danger and may in fact cause Biden to preemptively pardon all the people, on Patel's list. And one can debate whether that's a good idea or not. It would certainly help to ultimately discredit any kind of, the notion that the Justice Department could be impartial and in terms of all of that. So and then let's not forget the threat to the media that Trump calls the enemy of the American people, very chillingly. And he's threatened on many occasions to take away the licenses of broadcast networks which offend him. And I would just look to the intimidating impact of all of this on anybody who dares to criticize Trump, from the writers at the Washington Post or the New York Times, or let's face it, regular folks like us who might write a critical post about Trump on social media. But now maybe we'll think, is that a good idea? The only way to fight this, the only way to stand against this imminent threat to basic freedom of speech is for people of all backgrounds and all political opinions to join together and speak up loudly and march for freedom of expression, despite the very real risks that in doing so. But we cannot allow Trump and the right to divide us by appearing to support they're appearing to support one community over other ones.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And finally, in that context, I want to talk about this in terms of the whole issue of anti-Semitism, which I think has been weaponized by the right in ways to pull us apart. But also in that context, influential Jewish organizations need to cease efforts to weaponize anti-Semitism, such as pushing Congress to write into law a definition of anti-Semitism that characterizes criticism of Israeli policies as indicative of anti-Semitism. We shouldn't forget that the new Trump administration has signaled that it intends to withhold federal funding from many of America's top universities under the spurious claim that they are encouraging anti-Semitism. Now, this line fits perfectly with the overtly anti-intellectual agenda of the MAGA movement, but it should be anathema to a Jewish community that defended freedom of expression against repressive waves throughout the 20th century during the time of McCarthyism and the Vietnam War and during the Civil Rights Movement, but now seems inclined to outlaw anti-Zionism.
And at the same time, Muslim leaders should emphasize that Jewish students have the right to proclaim solidarity with Israel and must denounce threats to their physical safety.
Right, I absolutely agree with that. Now, on this whole issue of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, as I just noted, the Jewish communal organizations have been, some of them, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and others, Jewish community relations councils across the country, have been avid that the federal government, as well as state governments and local governments, should officially adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which includes language conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. For example, denying the Jews the right to self-determination, or accusing Israel of racism, or even applying a double standard by criticizing Israel more intensely than other democratic countries, even though Israel is indeed unique among democratic countries in having occupied another people for 55 years. So the overall impact of this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is to make it legitimate to repress pro-Palestinian speech as hate speech. And that is unacceptable and unsustainable in a democracy. Ultimately, again, we need to come back, we Muslims and Jews need to come back to the principle that we need to stand up for each other when either of our communities or any community, including mainstream Christians, are under attack. This was, the guiding, as I said, the guiding principle of our movement from, I would say, 2006 onward, and must be revived. By standing up for one another, we form a united front and do not allow our totalitarian adversaries to pick us off one by one.
And Walter, I would say that we must caution our communities to refrain from labeling one another or labeling the actions of the other with loaded terms like terrorists, genocide, or anti-Semitic. It only drives us further apart. We can settle for less incendiary terms and still get our message across. In recent months, there has been considerable debate on the term genocide. Countless hours have been spent arguing whether Israel's killings of tens of thousands of civilians in Gaza constitutes genocide, potential genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, or a less loaded term. Can we just focus on relieving the suffering, on stopping the killing? on ending the starvation, ask a mother in Gaza what matters to her. When she watches her child dying of starvation, does it matter to her whether we call it genocide? All that matters to her is that her child be fed and that her child live. Ask a boy who is undergoing amputation of his leg without anesthesia if we should call this genocide. All that matters to him is surgery without pain and being able to walk again. Ask that to an elderly who are living in the open, freezing temperatures. All that they want is to have a roof over their head. They don't care what label we give to their freezing to death. Can we just work on ending this humanitarian catastrophe?
Sabia, I completely agree with you. To my mind, the genocide charge is a conversation stopper that worsens our relationships. Because most Jews feel in their kishkas, their gut, that that there's something anti-Semitic, something very much attacking every Jew, to charge the community that suffered, that after all suffered the largest genocide in the history of the world, with the crime of genocide itself. And it's just a very visceral reaction. We can fine tune the definition of genocide. That's something else. The problem is that gut reaction by many of us, including myself, also allows us to sort of minimize and look away from and minimize what the IDF is doing in Gaza, which is pretty terrible, and to which terms like war crimes or ethnic cleansing might certainly apply. And obviously but obviously the charge of genocide is leading to a breakdown in communication between our communities. So one local example that I can talk about very personally is in my hometown of Frederick, Maryland, where for almost a year now, a coalition of Unitarians, Quakers, the NAACP and the Black community, the local mosque, as well as young leftists, so a pretty impressive coalition, has been demanding that the City Council of Frederick pass a resolution accusing Israel of committing genocide with US supplied arms. So that's what they've been pushing forward, and they've been going to city council meetings for weeks and weeks pushing this, while the Jewish community, for its part, has successfully lobbied behind the scenes the city council not to take it up. So people come and give this public testimony, but they need a member of the city council to join them in putting up this resolution, and that doesn't happen. The problem is that instead of meeting, let's say having the two sides meet and search for compromise language that would demand a ceasefire and large-scale humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza, the initiators of the resolution insist on describing the situation as genocide, and that has caused both political paralysis and hurt interfaith relations here in Frederick. And the question is this to anyone's benefit?
Yeah, true. So where do we go from here? I'd say, excuse me, allow peaceful campus protests. If we try to shut the other down, it will do more harm than curtailing free speech. It will further fracture our communities and prevent us from working together on causes that are critical for our survival. And let's not weaponize anti-Semitism to shut down protests. We are detaining, jailing, arresting those who are raising voices for peace and for humanitarian aid. And now NGOs are threatened. Jews and Muslims need to stand up for the principle of free speech, including speech that some of us find offensive. Speaking for myself, the suffering of the Gazans means a lot and remains a top priority. I want my Jewish brethren and elected officials to appreciate that this sentiment runs deep. This is going to be hard.
I agree with you. We have to fully hear that sentiment with the respect and compassion that it deserves, even if we ultimately choose to prioritize saving America from the specter of fascism. But we certainly have to engage how deeply, deeply hurtful it is to Palestinians and Muslims to watch this unfolding horror in Gaza, which never seems to end.
There are some hopeful portents related to our relationships here. For example, there are several women's groups whose efforts give me hope, and these deserve our support. One of them is the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. It's a national group of American, Muslim, and Jewish women who are committed to forging peace and have been working ardently to uphold peace here at home. After October 7th, when we met for our annual conference in November of last year, the atmosphere was tense. 1,200 Israelis and 12,000 Palestinians had been killed then. And in that moment, I wasn't sure what the future of the sisterhood would be. Yet, the sisterhood continued to hold listening and learning sessions throughout the past year. And this November, when we met for our annual conference just last month, I felt a shift in tone, a noticeable, palpable shift. Our Jewish and Muslim sisters were on the same page. At least that's what I felt and observed. We were experiencing the feeling that we are all in this together. I belong to a sisterhood chapter in New York City, where we decided, after several conversations, that to understand one another, we needed to educate ourselves. Yeah, the humanitarian catastrophe is visible, but how much do we know about the history of the land and the recent history? So we selected books, read them, and met to share our thoughts. We selected documentaries, watched them in our own time, and met to share our thoughts. All this has deepened our understanding and our empathy towards one another. Another group that I am part of is the Daughters of Abraham in Dialogue. Here we have gone beyond talking about our faith, beyond celebrating our holidays. We are now supporting one another's work, which is outside the realm of interfaith dialogue, and we show up for one another. And just as an example, when I held a reading of my play at the New York Library, the largest contingent of attendees was from the Daughters of Abraham.
That's those those are really important portents. And Sabia, and I think that I see also, I certainly have seen over the last number of months a shift in tone and belief by expressions of belief by many American Jews who really are saying that what the government of Israel, the Netanyahu government, is doing in Gaza, especially after the killing of Sinwar, that it seemed like that would be the end of it, but they've just continued this relentless killing. And there's been really great concerns about what's happening in the north of Gaza, the sealing off of it, the denial of humanitarian aid, and intimations of efforts to push the Palestinians out, to resettle Jews. All of that, many American Jews are deeply, deeply concerned about and not happy about, for sure. We've seen, for example, J Street, which is a large Jewish group, pro-Israel Jewish group, has, but nevertheless, has taken issue for many years over the settlements and other issues that the Israeli government pushes. But now, in the early months after October 7th, J Street stood pretty much in line with what the Israeli government was doing, and it was. But recently, first of all, J Street endorsed a ceasefire, and now also calls for a cutback in U.S. military aid to Israel if the government of Israel continues along the path it is with the fighting and other things. So that's, I think, an important portent, and that's certainly not the only group that's saying that. A project that I'm involved in is called Project Rosanna, which works to strengthen Israeli-Palestinian relations through healthcare. And recently, Rosanna became involved in spearheading a new initiative inside of Gaza, where we have not been able to work before, together with a mainly Palestinian NGO called ANERA. So the idea is, it's called the Mobile Tent Healthcare Initiative. And it's basically getting medical aid to thousands of Gazans. I think it's already, in the last 3 months, over 20,000 Gazans have been seen by doctors for a variety of issues, some of them life-threatening, some of them with chronic conditions and care for women, for pregnant women, and many other things. And the vast majority of these people would not have been able to have received this health care without this intervention through this initiative. And so the interesting thing is, many American Jews are contributing financially to this cause, together with Christians and Muslims. Let us at least work to save Palestinian lives to the extent that we possibly can, even if we can't directly impact immediately bringing about a ceasefire.
Yeah, and at this difficult hour, we need people of faith, particularly the clergy of all faiths, to be a collective voice of conscience in upholding the values of brotherhood. We want our clergy to staunchly oppose our country's descent into hatred and bigotry. One example I have experienced is as a member of the Torah Quran study group, which was spearheaded 4 years ago at the Temple Emmanuel in New York City. We've been meeting all this time, all through the 2 wars, and we have continued to meet and deepen our understanding of one another. And all that helps and contributes towards empathy and understanding. There can be no credible interfaith movement without Jews and Muslims. We are the 2 largest minority faiths in America. And we must focus on human rights, not politics, and have a unifying message and be willing to get uncomfortable. Schools have to play a role and be proactive in preventing bullying, which means that parents need coaching and counseling on how to prevent transmitting hatred to their children. Very true.
And I just one point I wanted to throw in here. We've laid out reasons to believe that on many fronts the Trump administration is hostile or inimical to many of the values and issues that we stand for. On the other hand, we should leave out the possibility that on the international front, Trump could possibly shake things up in a positive way in the Middle East. After all, we shouldn't forget that he accuses the neocons who played a big role in starting in leading America into the war in Iraq. He's called them warmongers. He's talking about Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and others. So that's one thing. He keeps talking, and he doesn't appear anxious to go to war with Iran in anyone else's interest, including Israel. And then we suddenly see the collapse of the Assad administration in Syria, which just shows the fluidity of the situation. So look, it's possible that the Trump administration, working in concert with the Saudis, the UAE, Egypt, and Israel too, may be able to come up with a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, and a grand bargain that would allow the rebuilding of Gaza under Palestinian sovereignty and the eventual creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. All of that would mean breaking with the Israeli hard right and their evangelical and some Jewish supporters. So it doesn't appear to me that the portents of that happening are good, but the jury is still out. So we should leave that. Keep that in mind.
The jury is still out. Mhm.
Jury is definitely still out. We're just at the beginning of this
Yeah.
period. Finally, in conclusion, I would just say, let's face it, let's be honest. It's both scary and it's risky to stand up to a soon-to-be president
Mhm.
who has vowed to exact retribution on his political enemies. I mean, some might say, might it not be better for Jews and Muslims to lie low for the moment and kind of see how things play out? But I believe the hard truth is that we simply cannot afford to do that, because once our fundamental rights have been taken away, it is very hard to get them back. Once a dictatorship is in place, one literally risks his or her life to oppose it openly. The time to join forces and to speak up collectively is now. And Muslims and Jews emphatically need to be a part of that.
Very true. Thank you for listening, for tuning in, and for your time. Have a blessed and safe holiday season.
Thank you.